Good morning, Energy Rogue Nation. Welcome back to another weather discussion. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Listen, before we get started with today's discussion, I want to give a quick programming reminder. We will be joining Brian and Bill on their weekly Energy Rogue live stream next Wednesday. It has been quite a while since I've done a live stream with them, so we'll be talking a lot about the weather heading into the second half of this year, especially for what's ahead this winter season. Are we going to be seeing this cold winter, or are we going to have more of the same like we've seen the last couple of years with just mild temperatures? We'll talk a lot about that during that discussion, and also we'll touch on some European weather too, so you're going to want to stay tuned for that. It's going to be next Wednesday, 12 p.m. Central, and if you can't catch it live, it's always posted on the LinkedIn pages and other social media sources in case you need to go back and watch it. I will, however, that being said, I will be touching on a couple of these things during today's video, but we're going to go a lot more in depth during that discussion. So you're going to want to tune in next Wednesday, 12 Central, to hear more about it. Otherwise, in today's video, we're going to be talking about the tropics and giving you an update on what is down the line in the Atlantic Basin, and also the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico in these next couple of weeks. Things could get kind of interesting, as we've sort of alluded to in the last week or so. We'll touch more on that during today's discussion. And of course, we'll also be talking about the temperature trends here, not just over the next couple of weeks, but also the next couple of months. And like I said, I'm going to reserve a lot of that conversation for the Energy Rogue live stream next week. But one thing that I want to note is that we are going to be heading into a La Nina pattern that does tend to favor more of a jet stream that brings cold air downward, or I should say equatorward, from the poles, and that would be for the northern United States, seeing those below average temperatures. But ultimately, while the pattern may support that, the question becomes, how cold would it really get? And that's something that we'll be talking about a little bit later on in this video, and of course next week. But let's begin first with the tropics. Here is what is left of Tropical Storm Debbie, and let me tell you, she has just rained hell on the Carolinas the last couple of days. Something that we have been really discussing and harping on the channel is that while Tropical Storm Debbie might just be a tropical storm, doesn't mean that the hazards and life-threatening conditions still don't exist, especially since this storm has significantly slowed down and stayed almost stationary around the Carolinas and now towards the central portion of the Appalachians. And with it, it's brought some pretty significant flooding. We've seen close to, in some spots, 2 feet of rain. And also, not just that, but significant tornadoes. I don't know if you were watching last night. Many of you may not. It may not even be in the news cycle, but we had a significant tornado move through, I believe it was the Raleigh-Durham area last night. So you got to remember, these tropical storms under the current environment, yeah, it may not be the strongest system, but when you get it stuck in one place and it precipitates for 24 to 48 hours over a few spots, that rainfall total really begins to add up, and that can lead to some life-threatening flooding. And unfortunately, we've already seen quite a few lives lost from this system. Now, will continue to move off towards the north and impact the Northeast and New England. It is now below tropical storm status. It's, I believe, a tropical depression at this point, but that does not mean for folks in the Northeast you should be letting your guard down. We could certainly be seeing some significant flash flooding up there towards the latter half of this week into the weekend. So you're going to want to stay tuned to your local weather service for further information on that. And also don't let your guard down, because we could certainly be seeing that as our main hazard for those areas. Now, that system, as it continues to move off towards the north, we also have seen a lot of activity out towards the eastern Pacific, and we haven't really seen much of that hit land. As a matter of fact, all of this convection is mostly just moving off the coast of Mexico and out to sea. We have seen a couple of tropical storms and even one hurricane out in the eastern Pacific, even to the point where both of them have now merged with each other, what's called the Fujiwara effect, where they essentially spin around each other. And we've seen some significant weakening with some of those storms that have now collided. So I didn't get a chance to loop that for you guys, but if you want to learn more about the Fujiwara effect, you can certainly look up some videos. It's a fascinating and pretty rare phenomenon to take place in weather. That really takes care of the Pacific discussion. We're not so much focused on that for today. Our main concern is actually out towards the eastern Atlantic. And this has been a part that has been relatively quiet over the last few weeks because of the Saharan dust, which I told Bill I think I need to make a drinking game of that for those that legally can, because I think I've said Saharan dust about 30, 40 times in the last 2 weeks. But nonetheless, we're actually beginning to see that taper down. And if you've been watching these videos the last couple of weeks, you've also known that much of our convection out in the Eastern Pacific has been pretty quiet. I mean, we weren't really seeing much activity, and it was because of that dry air that was originating from the Saharas that was pretty much capping a lot of that potential for convection. But that's beginning to change because, as you can see circled here in pink, we're beginning to see those darker reds again, and that's showing us really deep convection that's beginning to form. We're now seeing more of a healthier Atlantic basin, and that certainly could mean implications over the next couple of weeks for areas downstream, especially towards the Lesser Antilles, Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, and even parts of Florida. Now, I want to just put a disclaimer to that. We don't have any named systems yet. We don't even have an invest, but we are monitoring this area of the Atlantic for additional development as soon as the next 7 to 14 days, relatively short term. So let me revert back for a moment to the Saharan dust conversation because, as I realize, I totally just lost that tab. So let me go back in real time. But what I want to show you is why we're seeing an uptick in convection. Now, this is a loop of the Saharan dust plume, and these pinker colors are going to correspond to more dry air. But as you notice, even in the last 5 days, a lot of those pinks and reds have really dropped significantly. And one of the things that I've been hinting at with each and every one of you these last few videos is that we are beginning to encroach on the end of the Saharan dust climatological season. Typically, we begin to see the Saharan dust plume decrease by the time we get to the middle of August in early September. So it's right around that time that we are starting to see the worst of the Saharan dust and that dry air begin to decrease. As it does so, look what's happening in the Eastern Atlantic. Now we're seeing convection really begin to pop off, and that's because, again, there's not much inhibition going on. Not just in the way of dry air, but also wind shear. So less wind shear, less dry air, and also warm sea surface temperatures is a wonderful combination to create some deep and robust convection out in the Atlantic basin. And so the other thing I wanted to show you, though, is there's another catalyst to this. It's not just decrease in dry air, decrease in wind shear, it's also our high pressure positioning. So as a matter of fact, let me go back here on this same website, and I guess what I'll do is let's go over to, I think I had it at the layer mean wind analysis. Here we go, perfect. So this is the latest map, and this is looking at, by the way, our 700 to 850 millibar map. This is showing us air masses. So out here, and I'm going to draw this in black, is our area of high pressure, right? Now, what's significant about this is that our high pressure out in the central Atlantic was not positioned this way even a few days ago. Our high pressure was actually closer to the coastal Carolinas, and that's what had helped to lodge Tropical Storm Debby at the time in place. Now that this high pressure has moved off towards the east, we're beginning to see Tropical Storm Debby become dislodged and move towards the north. But what that means for the Atlantic basin is that as you mitigate your high pressure east, I'm going to draw it off to the side. So pretend with me that this is the United States. Here's my high pressure, right? Remember, these high pressures spin clockwise in the northern hemisphere. This high pressure has now moved off eastward, and it is now in this position. What that does for the Atlantic basin is that because your high pressure is positioned more off into the east central Atlantic Ocean, you now have more convection that increases in the Atlantic basin because of it. Beforehand, when that high pressure was out towards the Carolinas, for example, because of its positioning, you weren't seeing much activity here either. So there really is three catalysts here. Not just the dry air, not just the wind shear, but also high pressure positioning. Because ultimately, with high pressure being in this spot, storms love to form within this quadrant of the high. Whenever we see these easterly prevailing winds, these storms really begin to convect. And begin to develop. So that is also a sign that we are going to be seeing an uptick in activity in the Atlantic basin here over the next couple of weeks. If we take this and apply it to our current model guidance, this map I'm about to show you, you are probably like, whoa, what is going on here? There's so much going on. I don't want you to focus on the greens or the reds and the greens and even those blue lines you see. I want you to focus in on these orange circles. These orange circles that you see across this map is corresponding to areas of vorticity, or in other words, areas of low pressure, right? So watch what happens here on the GFS, for example, as we go into the next couple of weeks. So we'll take this into late this week, early next week, and you see that our high pressure now is positioned in the eastern Atlantic, and look what happens here. So let's take it a step back, and let's take it forward. So our high pressure is now in the eastern Atlantic. Look at Africa, right? Look off the coast of Africa. Most importantly, look at the Atlantic Basin. Now we're beginning to see robust convection come off the Saharas and the Western Africa portion. And that is because of our high pressure positioning, right? Because we've moved our high pressure further east, and that is helping to develop large swaths of pretty robust convection across the Atlantic. So again, I'm going to go back so I don't lose anybody. So let's go back to the beginning, and let's look at now. So this is the Atlantic. This is going out even just in the last 12 hours. And then if we go out even the next few days, look at the difference. Now we have several systems encompassing the Atlantic and as well as the Eastern Pacific. 2, 3, 4, 5. So there's a lot of things that are coming together here with the Atlantic Basin, and what I will tell you guys now is certainly what I've not been somebody to do is to fearmonger or hypecast, and that's not anything you'll ever get from me. What I'm telling you today is what I always tell you in weeks leading up to these systems like Beryl and Debbie. Keep an eye on the Atlantic Basin, and also an honorable mention, keep an eye on the Caribbean. These two areas we need to watch very closely, considering the parameter space that's going to evolve here over the next few to several days, and that would take us into the next couple of weeks. Speaking of which, and by the way, we can also look at different model solutions as well. I believe the euro doesn't go out, it's not going to go out as far, but we can still look at the euro, and as you can see on this chart, we also are seeing multiple low pressures. So model guidance is pretty confident on that, especially considering the fact that our high pressure would continue to move off towards the east and thereby increase a lot of the activity in the Atlantic Basin as well as the Caribbean as a result. But what I wanted to show you, so again, my whole point of showing them other models too is to give you some consensus on where the model suite stands. There are other solutions we can pull from, but just for the sake of conversation, just know there's pretty high confidence in the uptick of activity here within this region outlined in pink over these next couple of weeks. The National Hurricane Center is also looking at this pretty closely. Let me go ahead and pull it up for you guys here as well. They have actually highlighted a 30% chance area of development over the next several days. Now, one thing I want to note with these charts, because I know these are pulled all the time, when they say 30% chance, that's talking about, for one, within the next 7 days. It could happen tomorrow. It could happen in 5 days, or maybe towards the end of this week. It's really within that period. But also, this is 30% probability of development in that period for now. What we saw similar to Debbie is, if you remember, they were highlighting a very similar area for development and a very similar probability, but you saw that probability increase with time. So it's 30% at the moment, but I actually expect those probabilities to go up considering everything we just talked about. I would anticipate it going up maybe 10 to 20% over the next several days once we begin to see some development show up and for models to pick up on it. We're already seeing models kind of splotch areas, and they're also splotching some further development down the line. So National Hurricane Center is looking at it. We're also monitoring it pretty closely. And for me as a forecaster and a meteorologist, I am certainly, I got my eyes pretty much glued to the Atlantic right now. That's what I'm telling you guys. I actually am pretty high confidence we see some form of development within the next couple of weeks considering the changes that we are expecting. So whether or not that it impacts the United States, that is too far to say and not for me to predict this far out at this time. But we are certainly not done with the tropical weather season whatsoever. Definitely not. It is, to me, it is only the beginning as we head into peak hurricane season. Now, the other conversation to talk about is our temperatures. We've been talking about that a little bit, but not to a highly detailed degree. So let's start first with our GFS ensemble. And we'll take a look at the North American map. 12Z run is rendering now. We'll go ahead and take a look here at 6Z. And a little bit more of the same. A lot of folks have been talking about the heat down in Texas and for much of the southern United States. It's going to be because of that ridge of high pressure that's expected to expand and continue to sit right around the four corner states and the western United States here over the next couple of days. By the way, this map is of our jet stream. Any of the greens and yellows you see are corresponding to our jet flow. We have a lot of low pressure moving through the Midwest and the Northeast. That's going to bring some cooler conditions. Also something to note, we are likely to see some cooler conditions for the Northeast and the Midwest. A lot of that not just because of extratropical cyclones, but also because of Tropical Storm Debbie that's going to be bringing some rainfall and keeping those temperatures pretty mild for the Northeast and New England regions as well over the next couple of days. As we head into the weekend, into Sunday and early next week, we continue to see the heat, and it really is going to stay for this area circled in pink for the South Central United States, Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Four Corners. That is going to be the main event of the heat, and we already have heat advisories out for this area, and that heat's going to be prolonged not just for this week, but also in the next week, as we see, based upon the fact that we have an upper level ridge that sits pretty much in the same spot. Now, as I've also been saying, folks in the Midwest, we will likely see some fluctuation in our temperatures, especially towards the Great Lakes. It's going to be more of just this fluctuation between some warmer temperatures and cooler temperatures, and that also goes somewhat for the Mid-Atlantic. So we're going to see a lot more variability for the lower Great Lakes, Northeast New England during this period, but a lot of consistent heat, though, for the southern half of the United States. And remember, as I talked about in our population weighted degree day conversation last time, the thing is, when we have hotter temperatures in the south, that's going to certainly influence the CDD values for this area. And as a matter of fact, if we were to plot the GFS run for our population weighted degree days, you would see that the South is going to be the number one region for cooling degree days in the entire country, not just based on the heat, but also influencing that is there's a very high population density in this area circled. So combine those two together, and that's how you get your population weighted degree days. So the region in the South Central United States here circled, as well as the South Atlantic United States, is going to be seeing much of the warmth here. So you may be thinking a lot of these NOAA maps are showing some cooler temperature probabilities for the Midwest and the Northeast. Do not let your guard down. That does not mean we're done with the heat whatsoever. As a matter of fact, let me show you one of these maps as an example, looking at the next 6 to 10 days, right? So you see, according to NOAA, right, if we take a look closely at this map, yes, we have some cooler temperatures out west. Of course, that is of influence. There's a pretty high population out there out towards our Pacific region, and also some near normal temperatures due to what would be Tropical Storm Debbie. But the heat still remains for the South Central United States, variability up towards the north. You may see some cooler temperatures in spots, but I think the main event that we've seen in the news cycle is always the heat. It's not necessarily cooler temperatures, it's the extremes. So if we're talking about these well above average temperatures, they are still going to be around over the next couple of weeks, and that is going to continue to hit the news cycle because we are not anticipating any sort of Arctic plunge or any sort of extreme colder temperatures than normal that would really catch our attention. That's not going to be the case. It's going to be more of the same here for the broader weather storylines. Now, if we look ahead to the next couple of months, I want to just give you a sneak preview on that. This has been something that, we've been talking about even on the Energy Row live streams, and we'll also be touching on next week, so stay tuned for that. But we've been really looking here at this upper level ridge that's dominated the West, and that's been the theme of many of our conversations here. But the climate models have actually been pretty consistent on transitioning to more of this zonal flow. Zonal flow basically means that rather than these ridges and troughs that show up in our jet stream, it's more of a straight west to east orientation. Now, what this would imply for temperatures, if we were to take this at face value, and by the way, this would head into the fall months. We're talking here about October, November. This would imply more of I wouldn't even say variable temperature, more of some mild temperatures. Because remember, if we're having air coming from the Pacific, that's Pacific air, that's going to keep temperatures mostly mild for much of the United States. Maybe some cooler variability out towards the Midwest at times, even the Northeast. But for the most part, some mild to cooler temperatures kind of mixed in towards the fall. May even feel fall-like, again, if we took this at face value. And then as we head towards what would be January, notice the difference here. It may not be hard or may not be easy to see, but remember that ridge we showed here in August? Look what happens. We go from a ridge to more of this broader trough. And this is what's mostly common with a La Nina pattern. The idea that we have a ridge out west and that brings colder air and advects it southward into the northern United States. That's what we're watching pretty closely, both on the CAN-SIPS as well as the CFS model, which also shows it here as we head towards December and January. Now, one thing that I want to mention as a preview to the broader discussion next week. These climate models, as always, are subject to change. There is no such thing in meteorology as a silver bullet. That's number one. But this does take into account what we are expecting for our, I would say, climate pattern change. That's not the word I wanted to use, but essentially transitioning from more of a El Nino to a La Nina by the time we get to December and January. These models are picking up on that, and it's depicting colder air being advected southward into the northern United States. But that also leads to my second caveat. Even though we are expecting a pattern that would be favorable for these low pressures to be advected into the Midwest and Northeast, bringing colder air, especially the upper Midwest and this area circled in pink, it may be a pattern that supports colder air, but how cold would it be? Because I think the one thing that I want everyone to know and to keep in the back of your mind as we head towards winter, you are definitely going to see storylines that talk about La Nina and what does that mean for the winter season? I mean, it's going to happen, right? With La Nina, just because we have a pattern that supports colder temperatures doesn't mean that we're going to see extreme cold temperatures necessarily. The last two La Nina cycles that we had were actually quite mild. They were not really cold by definition, right? We were still seeing some mild temperatures similar to what we saw last year. So my only question as a forecast that I have is, okay, we have high probability of a La Nina, which right now is somewhere between about 60 to 70% chance, if not even higher than that. That's great. But are we going to see stratospheric warming events that would bring that, polar vortex and the Arctic blast that would really bring down those colder temperatures? Right now, it's pretty early to say. And my only concern is, I look here at the short term, I'm beginning to wonder, how cold is it truly going to be this year? Are we actually going to see these big lows that are dislodged from the Arctic, that polar jet, and dislodge further south and bring these colder temperatures? Or are we going to see just kind of a laggard winter again? And quite frankly, I think that we're going to see, certainly better probabilities of colder temperatures for these areas. I just wonder how really cold it's going to get. For the Midwest, for example, in Chicago, I've lived here all my life. Usually we're looking at anything below 25 below wind chills. That's pretty cold for us. If we're talking 30, 40 degrees, like we saw last year, that's nothing. A lot of people even wear shorts in 35 degrees out in the Midwest. That's not cold to us. So that's why when we start to talk about, degree days, but also temperature normals, that comes into play too. I mean, how truly cold is it for this area of the country? It may be cold to people in the South, but how cold is it for them? And that's something that we're going to be continuing to discuss and really hone in here over these next several weeks as we begin to transition from summer towards the fall season. Listen, guys, thank you so much for tuning in and sticking with me these last several minutes in this discussion. If you have any questions, feel free to post those down in the chat below. And we will see you back here on Saturday with another weather update, but then we will also be seeing you on Wednesday for the Energy Rogue weekly live stream. You're going to want to really stay tuned for that. You'll also be getting some sneak peeks about some of the products we're going to be launching as part of the Weather Rogue package. Take care. Have a great rest of your day.